So hi everyone, thank you very much for watching or listening. Liam Hartree here today with another episode of the Simply Inspired podcast with presenting champions today. Today's guest, I'm very honored to be joined by Keely Shaw, who has many accolades to her name. First and foremost, para-athlete, Paralympian, has won a bronze medal at the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, incredible achievement. Has won silver at the Track World Championships. I've got a list of them here, by the way, Keely, because you won some great stuff. Road World Championships, bronze medals there. This lady today has a truly inspirational story in her journey, in her meteoric rise as well, through track cycling, which is the discipline that she practices, and that is where those medals have come from. Today, it's not just going to be a sports story, although sports is really the backdrop and the framework for this. Today, we're going to be getting into some excellent inspiration, motivation, and really get into the life lessons that Keely has learned along the way in her journey to the top of her game. These are life lessons that people can apply to any area of life. So that's enough of me talking about you in third person. Sorry about that. Keely, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's lovely to have you with us today. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to get into it today.
Absolutely. So I think what we'll do with your story is start at the beginning. Now, I don't always start at the beginning. Sometimes I actually start at where we are now and work backwards. But today, let's start at the beginning of your journey with your upbringing, your early life, up until the point where your life changed and took a radically different direction, which we'll get into in a moment. Now, I'm sure you talk about this a lot, so I know it's a reasonably large expanse of time. I've said let's just get into that. But please tell us a little bit about your early life and where your journey began. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I am a Canadian athlete. So I'm based out of Canada. I live in Saskatchewan, which is kind of right in the middle of Canada. And I grew up in a really small town on a farm just outside of a really small town. My hometown has about 500 people in it, so just teeny tiny. And I grew up on a farm, and on this farm, we had all sorts of animals. And growing up, because I think it's pretty typical of rural kids in Canada, I played every sport imaginable. I played ice hockey, I played volleyball, I played badminton, I raced my dirt bike. I dabbled in a little bit of baseball, I dabbled in a little bit of soccer. If it was offered, I was trying it out. But really, my true and first love was ice hockey. It seemed like my life was just all these things that happened in between hockey practice, in between hockey games. And that was really my goal. And when I started playing hockey when I was probably around 6 or 7. And then by the time I was 10, I told my mom I wanted to go to the Olympic Games to play hockey. So it became a singular focus quite early in my life. And then as I started to get older, I started to kind of realize the steps that might take. So for me, that meant playing AA hockey, that meant playing AAA hockey, getting on a university team, and then maybe one day getting on the Olympic team. So that was kind of the rise that I hoped to see in myself. And when I was 15 in grade 10, I had just made that AA hockey team. So in Canada, kind of for ice hockey, we have our house level, which is anybody can play. You have to try out for the AA team, which would be the next category up for as far as caliber of play, and then it's AAA. So I was 15, and I just made this AA hockey team. So I thought this is my first step on this pathway that I had laid out for myself in order to get to the Olympic hockey team. And one day in November, it was early November, and in November in Canada, it's typically actually really quite cold. Sometimes we can have quite a bit of snow, and I would say on average, it might be like kind of -2 degrees as a high. So it can be quite cool even as early as November. But on this particular day in November, it was 2009, it was 13 above or something. So it was very warm. And my parents raised elk. So I was going to go raise the elk. I was going to go check the elk, for water to make sure they had some out in the field. So I hopped on my horse and I hopped on bareback, which was something that I did quite commonly when I was checking the elk for water, because it was a very short ride. It was something I was very comfortable doing. But on this particular day, because it was so warm out, it was just lovely. It was a Monday, I was off school. I decided to take a slightly different route than normal just because I was enjoying this fall weather so much. And while I was thoroughly enjoying myself, my horse, it seemed, was not. So my horse Bud decided he was ready to go home. And he just kind of took off. He didn't buck, he didn't kick me, he didn't step on me. He just took off. And because I wasn't wearing a saddle, I didn't have anything to hold on to. So I fell and Bud went home. And I was knocked unconscious when I hit the ground. And I remember waking up to my cell phone ringing because my dad was calling me. My horse was home and I was not. And naturally, anybody listening that's a parent can imagine how terrifying that might be. So I remember answering the phone and I kind of felt like I was in a dream. It was something I've never experienced before. It's just the feeling of it. And my dad knew right away, okay, Keely, you've got a concussion, stay exactly where you are. We're going to come get you. So mom and dad came out to get me and we ended up going to the hospital. They did all their tests, they did all their checks, and they said, yep, she's definitely got a concussion. They send you home with a list of symptoms to watch for, and they say, if any of these arise, give us a call right away. So we go home with this list of symptoms to watch for, kind of going about our daily evening life, trying to think of everything that needs to be done. Okay, we got to let the teachers know I'm not going to be in school tomorrow. I'm not going to be at hockey practice for the next week. I can't go to volleyball this weekend. Trying to kind of check all those things to make sure that all the different aspects of life that I was involved in knew I wasn't going to be there for like a week or so. And then that evening, I got up from the table and the world kind of started spinning. I got really dizzy and I just couldn't seem to get this world to stop spinning. And naturally, this is one of those symptoms that they say to watch for on this list of symptoms they send you home with. So my parents called the hospital and they reported that I was having these symptoms. And the hospital said, nope, she's fine. Just watch her. Just pay attention. This is going to pass. She'll be fine. So we continue on with our evening. And then later that evening, I started slurring my speech. And this, again, is one of those things they say to call if it shows up on the list. So once again, mom and dad called the hospital. And once again, they were told, no, she's fine. Just watch her. It'll pass. I actually don't remember anything after getting up from the table and the room started spinning, but apparently my mom had a really bad feeling in her gut that night, so she decided to sleep with me. And I guess I woke her up in the middle of the night because I had to go to the bathroom, but I couldn't move. So at this point, it's obvious that I'm not fine. They don't just need to watch me. An ambulance was called, 911 was called, they came out to the farm, and they said, meet us at Regina General Hospital, which was the closest hospital to my hometown. It was about a 2-hour drive away. And before the ambulance took off, they looked at my parents and said, don't try to keep up. This was an emergency. They were getting me there as quickly as possible. Once I got to the hospital, they did a CT scan of my brain and they found that I had broken a blood vessel deep within my brain. And this bleed was causing pressure to build up in my skull. And pressure on the brain can be it can be lethal, it can be deadly. But because this bleed was so deep in my brain, they didn't want to go in to stop the bleed unless they had no other option. They knew there was no way they were getting into my brain, stopping the bleed and getting back out without causing some sort of other damage. So they put a monitor in my head to monitor the amount of pressure building up, just trying to make sure it didn't go over these critical values that would need intervention. And luckily enough, the bleeding did stop on its own before the pressure had crossed that critical threshold. But my brain still needed to heal. So I was put into a coma and I was put on life support so that my brain could focus only on healing. All these other little things that your brain does, even when you're sleeping, helping you, telling you to breathe, telling your heart to beat, all these little things they put on the machine. So my brain could just heal. I was in a coma for somewhere between 3 days and a week when my mom asked the doctors what the prognosis was, whether she should call my brothers to come say goodbye. My oldest brother was in Afghanistan with the military at that time, so he would need some time to get back home. The doctor just kind of said, we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. You have to do what you feel is best for your family. But I've always had a bit of a stubborn streak in me, so mom didn't call the boys, having full faith in me that I would wake up. And sure enough, 7 or 10 days later, I did wake up. But when I woke up, I had zero feeling or function on the left side of my body. So it was kind of like somebody had drawn a line down the middle of my face, between my eyes, through my chest, all the way down to my toes. And on one side of that, on the right side, I'm perfectly normal. I'm fine. It's good to go. But on the left side, I can't feel it. I can't move it. When I smiled, only half my face would go up. If you were to touch my hand, I wouldn't be able to tell you were touching my hand. I had to be on a liquid diet because half of my throat didn't work. So I spent about 10 days in the intensive care unit and then was transferred to a rehab hospital where I would continue my physical rehab. I ended up getting about 50 to 70% function back in the left side of my body, depending on where you're looking. I've got a little bit more function in my leg, a little bit less in my hand, and my function varies day to day depending on if I've eaten well, if I'm stressed, if I've slept well, that kind of thing.
Well, first of all, Keely, let me say thank you for sharing that in such an open way. I know you've probably shared this 100 times or whatever, and people ask you about it, but I also respect that talking about a traumatic time in life like that is probably not an easy process, or maybe it is for you because you've spoken about it a lot. I don't know, but I still respect that there's a type of bravery in a way in sharing that in such a candid way. So thank you. I'd like to highlight something here before we move on to your future and everything, and university and cycling and other things that happened. At that time when you did wake up and you were going through this therapy and you were healing, your mindset at that time, I mean, you said that your mum had a lot of faith in you. She believed you'd get better. She believed you'd pull through. Did you believe that about yourself? You mentioned having a stubborn streak. When you woke up, when you came out of this, did you always believe that you would get back to, well, quite a good level, that things would be okay, even though your life would not be the same, or was there doubt? I'm just curious about the mindset side of things with that time, if that makes sense with that, because the reason I ask is not to sort of probe into anything about your life like that, but I think it's a valuable lesson for people who are going through hard times in other ways in their life, even if it's something similar to you, obviously, but if it's something different and they don't necessarily see a way out, obviously at that point in time, your body was weakened, so you would have been relying on your mind, your will, your sort of inner qualities, if that makes sense. So I was just curious to see how you kept the faith that you would get through it at that time immediately after the accident, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think immediately after, I remember waking up and I think the first thing I said after I woke up was, Dad, that was all a bad dream, right? Like I didn't fall off my horse. I'm not in the hospital. And of course, Dad saying, well, no, Dolly, I'm sorry, but you've been hurt really bad. But I don't think I realized just how bad or just how serious it was. It, yeah, like I don't even know. I never remember thinking like, oh no, what's going to happen? In the early stages, I think it was just really taking it one day at a time. And in the early stages, I was making relatively quick progress. It wasn't, it was probably only a week before I moved up to soft foods as opposed to liquid foods. And I started to have a little bit more facial movement when I smiled. So in the early days, the progress was very quick. And I think having that constant reinforcement was really beneficial. But I mean, really, at the end of the day, people always ask, how did you do it? But my option was to roll over and play dead or to get better. So to me, there was never really an option. And right from the get-go, my parents were incredible. If people wanted to come in to visit me, they made it very clear that it was to be a positive environment. There would be no crying, there would be no sadness. If you weren't ready to come in, talk to me like the 15-year-old that I was, and not somebody who had just had a brain injury, you weren't allowed to come in. My parents gate kept who was allowed to visit me, how often I was allowed to have visitors, like their life depended on it, because there's a very real possibility my life did depend on it. So first and foremost, my family was incredible. And then the doctors were also very encouraging because I was quite young. I'd been very active throughout my whole life. They were very optimistic that I would make substantial recovery. They never said full, but they did say I was likely to make a substantial recovery. And for me, I'd always been an athlete in some capacity, from figure skating from the time I was 3 or 4 years old, playing hockey, playing all these different sports. I knew what it was to train. So for me, my training just shifted. My training now, instead of going to hockey practice 2 days a week, 3 days a week, my training was now going to physical therapy twice a week. My training now was to do my exercises in my room. So I just kind of took that athlete mentality that I'd always had and that I had honed over the course of my 15 years and applied it to the situation I was in. And I really don't think it was until I was discharged from the hospital, I was back in my day-to-day life and I was back playing hockey, that I realized that I will never be the same. And for me, that was something that was really challenging. Even in the hospital, I was always, when can I play hockey? When can I skate? After the first time I walked, it wasn't even by myself. It was a nurse holding me up by a belt. I maybe took a total of 15 steps total. And when I plopped back down on the bed, I asked them, when could I skate? So that was really my motivation. It was always just, what can I do to get back to playing hockey? And when I did get back to playing hockey, I realized very quickly that I was no longer the hockey player I had been before I got hurt. I can't really hold on to my stick very well in my left hand. I can't do a full stride length on the left side of my body. I think the biggest problem for me now is the puck actually moves too fast. My brain can't keep up with it. It can't process that quickly anymore. And so this sport that I'd once loved and had felt like it was all of the best parts of me suddenly wasn't even fun. It was this thing that I kept playing hockey even though I wasn't having fun. But just because that was my entire identity. I didn't know who I would be if I couldn't be a hockey player. And this was something that it really weighed heavy on me for many, many years. So I got hurt in 2009. My last hockey season would have been the 2015-2016 season. So I played hockey for another 6 years of not actually enjoying the game anymore, really just counting down the minutes until practice was done, counting down the minutes until a game was done. And that really, really played a toll on my mental health. I really struggled figuring out how to get back to this hockey player I was, trying to figure out how to gain some sort of control in my life when it felt like everything that I had been ripped away from me. And I was diagnosed with an eating disorder, anorexia nervosa, almost a year to the day of being discharged from the rehab hospital for my brain injury. So it was almost, the timing was so incredible. It was like I missed 3 or 4 months of school for my brain injury, and then I missed 2 or 3 months of school from my eating disorder. And my eating disorder was something that I definitely did not make the same strides in recovery as I did with my brain injury. I struggled with my eating probably up until 2017. So with a diagnosis in 2011, that's 8 years or 6 years, 7 years of really just, it might sound dramatic, but mental turmoil every time I had to put something in my mouth because it was just so anxiety inducing. So that was something I really struggled with, and I continue to struggle with. And the only thing I found that eventually helped me kind of get over the hump to where I could think clearly about it was when I found cycling.
Well, incredible candor once again. And I know I said that before, but about things that really can't be easy to talk about. So thank you again for that, because I do respect, and even when I'm asking questions, I try to be sort of tactful about it, because I don't want you to think I'm sort of probing into you. But everything I ask is for the purpose of really of inspiring people. Is the simplest way I can put that into words. Because if you overcame these things, other people can too. It sounds almost a bit cheesy, but it is still the truth. So that's a big part of why I do what I do. When you found cycling, let's take this to well, in a way, a more cheerful point, because obviously then things started taking a turn for the better, and obviously so many wonderful things have happened since then. But in the beginning, cycling, how did you find it? What was your initial transition into the sport like? Just anything you'd like to share really about that first phase, if you like, of getting into cycling really.
Yeah, so cycling wasn't even on my radar for the longest time. But one day I was exercising at the University of Saskatchewan, where I was doing my bachelor's degree in exercise science. And a classmate came up to me and said, you know, Keely, I've heard about your brain injury. I've kind of seen how you move. I think you'd be classifiable for parasport if this is something that would interest you. And she starts telling me about all these incredible benefits of parasport. They'll hook you up with the best equipment, the best practitioners. If you make the national team, you'll get paid. They'll help pay for university, all these incredible possible benefits. And for me, all I heard was elite sport and the fact that I still had a possibility to pursue it. So of course I was game right away. I went with her to see her sports scientist who kind of watched me walk, watched me do a few different things and said, yeah, you're definitely classifiable as a para athlete. You have the amount of impairment that would be categorized under the Paralympic umbrella. Pick a sport. And when I went to see the sports scientist, it was December. So December in Canada is very much winter. There's lots of snow. It's very cold. So I'd heard we had a good cross country ski coach in the area. And I thought that might be a cool place to start. So I met up with a cross country ski coach, and it was apparent very, very early that that was not the sport for me. I was very cold. It was very hard. I was very bad. So that was a short-lived experiment. But I'd also heard that we had a pretty good cycling coach in the general area where I lived. So I thought maybe cycling would be something I would try. And at this point, I already had a bike that I was just using to commute back and forth to the university on. Nothing fancy, just a very cheap steel frame bike from the local box store. And so I thought, well, I've got the equipment to at least get started. Let's try this. So now we're in the summer of 2015, and I was kind of quote unquote training. And I use air quotes when I say training there because my long rides were like 20 kilometers, which might sound long to somebody who doesn't ride a bike, but to cyclists, that's quite laughable as a long ride. But that's where I started. I started at the bottom just like everybody else. It's not like I came in as this prodigy. And I continued to train and kind of continue to work on it. And then in 2016, when I finished my bachelor's degree, I bought myself a nice carbon race bike as a graduation present to myself. And I continued to train, continued to work, getting up to a little bit more respectable distances of 60, 65 kilometers for my long rides. And then in the spring of 2017, I decided it was time to try my hand at racing. So I entered just a local provincial race here in Saskatchewan, and I got on the start line, and after the race, I realized that I was in love again. I loved everything about it, the brute physicality of the sport. I loved the environment. The people were very welcoming. And I loved how I didn't feel like somebody with a disability. When I get on my bike, I don't feel asymmetrical. I don't feel like half my body doesn't move the way it's supposed to. And for the first time in years since I'd gotten hurt, that hole in my heart that had been left by hockey suddenly was filled. And as soon as I got home from that race, I went on the website of the Canadian Paralympic Committees, and I found every single email that I could on that website. And I said, I have a brain injury and I like to bike. Where do we go from here? So they put me in touch with Cycling Canada and their development coach, who we chatted a little bit over email. I sent him a couple of videos of my bike and the different adaptations I had. And he invited me out to a training camp. So I went out to my first training camp with the national team, and then soon enough, about a month later after that training camp, I was at nationals. And I thought I performed very poorly at nationals. I got last place in both my races. I was really questioning what I thought I was doing, whether I was even sane for being at national championships when I had only raced my bike a handful of times. But the national team coaches saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, and they said, we need to get her classified. So in parasport, we get classified based on our impairment so that we're competing against people of similar levels of impairment. And that only happens officially at international competition. And the next international competition was going to be track world championships in Rio de Janeiro. And I had barely gotten on a road bike, let alone a track bike. So I started going out to some of the track cycling camps that Cycling Canada had. And just once again, I fell in love. Track cycling's almost a little bit similar to hockey, just in the a little bit shorter bouts of really high intensity exercise as opposed to the long endurance of road cycling. And again, I just immediately fell in love, and I'd get off the track with this giant goofy smile on. And I eventually made the criteria that I needed to go out to Rio for World Championships. So in March of 2018, I attended my first World Championships. And in my very first race, I completely crapped the bed. It was awful. I started with my wrong leg out of the gate. I was slow, and everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. And once again, I was sitting there thinking, what am I doing here? At this point, I've raced my bike a total of like 7 times and never on the track. So what did I think I was doing? I didn't belong at World Championships with the best in the world. But I still had another race to go at that event. So my individual pursuit, which is my main event. An individual pursuit is a 3-kilometer race. You've got one person on each side of the track. The start gate goes off, and it's just 3 kilometers as fast as you can. In the beginning, you're not actually racing that other person on the track per se. You're just trying to get a time in order to qualify top 4 to race for a medal. And right off the bat, I was way ahead of schedule. We had been planning for about 22 seconds a lap, and I was doing 19.8 seconds a lap. So way faster than we had gone out planning for, but I felt incredible. My legs felt great. And when I finished that race, I was sitting first in my category. By the time everybody else had gone through, I finished 5th in the world, 3 seconds off a podium performance at my very first ever Trek event. From there, it's kind of been a bit of a whirlwind. Later that summer, I was in Holland for a World Cup, and I hit my first international podium with a silver medal at the Road World Cup. So now that's road cycling, not track cycling. Later that year in Italy, I got 4th at World Championships, which was kind of unprecedented. We didn't expect any of that from the newbie, who that was probably my 6th time trial ever. As of March of 2019, I broke the Canadian record, took 12 seconds off my time from Rio de Janeiro, and won a silver medal at Track World Championships. I had a little bit more success on the road that following season, just missing the podium far too many times for my comfort. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. The games were postponed, and I was able to kind of focus a little bit more on training, focus a little bit on school, and just fall in love with the bike again instead of the bike being my job. I was doing my master's degree throughout most of my racing career. I started my PhD, my doctoral degree in 2020, just before the pandemic started. So I was able to figure out what balance looked like with kind of things slowing down. I was able to find out what balance between training full-time and studying full-time looked like. I was very fortunate in 2021 in that I was able to spend a lot of time in Milton, Ontario, which is an indoor velodrome. And it's about 3,000 kilometers away, so I had to fly. But I was able to fly when the rest of the world was shut down to Ontario and train for 10 days every single month to really perfect my technique, to work one-on-one with a coach. And then come Tokyo, we thought we were ready for a silver medal performance. The whole plan was to go out in my qualifying race, have the race of my life, qualify second, and have a guaranteed medal going into the medal round. But I don't know what happened. I think just the nerves and the enormity of the situation hit me. And I actually probably had one of my worst performances in a very long time in that qualifying event in Tokyo. My legs were slow. I felt like I was pedaling through molasses. When I got off the track, I looked at my coach and said, "Where are my legs? These are not the legs we've been training on for the last week." But I was lucky enough, I still qualified, but this time I qualified for the bronze medal match instead of the silver medal that we'd been hoping for. But I really had to work at it and focus on how to reset my mind, because I didn't want to just sit there and think about how bad that last race had been. That wasn't going to set me up for success to win a medal. So we had planned out exactly what I was going to be doing in between my qualifying and my medal race in order to have me as fresh as possible. So for me, it was really just a matter of following the plan and sticking to the plan, trusting the process. And I was able to kind of refocus myself, get myself ready, and have that race that I was supposed to have in my medal round, winning Canada's first medal with a bronze in the individual pursuit. Now, paracycling is kind of interesting when you ride a two-wheeled bike because we have to race track and road, which are two completely different sports. Track's very much a power-based sport. Road's very much an endurance-based sport. But I think it was 5 or 6 days after I won a bronze medal, I had to get back on the course for a time trial on the road. So it was a 21-kilometer time trial outside. And there, I didn't get a medal, but I came in fourth, which is pretty close, not bad for a trackie. And then in the last season, I was actually probably one of my more successful seasons. Every road race I did, and you have to remember, road is not my specialty, track is my specialty. But I got a podium in every single road time trial and every single road race, including 2 bronze medals at world championships. So it was kind of an unprecedented year for me, which is especially interesting to think about because I actually had a really bad year health-wise. I started to get an uptick in brain injury symptoms, more physical symptoms, more cognitive symptoms in May. So we were really just, the amount of training that we could do was not nearly as high as we would have liked, just because I was struggling to manage some symptoms that were new to me. But I mean, we came out and we medaled at every single World Cup, and we medaled at Road World Championships, which I had never done before. So it was quite the year for me. I think I was really looking forward to Track World Championships, which were in Paris in October. And I tested positive for COVID 2 days before the races started, so I wasn't able to race. But based on the times that went down, I think I could have won a silver medal. So I'm really excited now. I've kind of got a fire burned under my butt to get me in gear to see what can happen in the coming years leading into the Paris 2024 Paralympic Games.
Incredible. I mean, what a story. There's so many things there. It's remarkably inspirational. It's really is something. One thing I wanted to highlight before we talk a little bit more about the future, I also want to touch on your education and some of the things you're doing there as well. But before we get into any of that, you've been very candid about the as well as the physical process, the mental process, the emotional process on the build up to certain races. So you said, sometimes you were very nervous, other times you felt more confident and there was more of a fire. These different processes, and there's never any talk of being sort of above any of these things. You're going through very human emotions. How do you handle that? Because the reason I ask this is because, as we mentioned at the beginning, your rise has been very swift, and I know you've given us an insight into what went on behind the scenes, so it possibly doesn't feel as swift to you. But you did mention it being a whirlwind, and you did mention this. So how do you handle being out of your comfort zone? How do you handle, you mentioned one of your early races didn't go very well, but you bounced back straight into another one. These sorts of emotional and psychological processes that I think a lot of people on the outside think that athletes are immune to. Obviously they're not, because we're all human. But you obviously have a way of handling them, keeping yourself together, performing at a high level. Again, this is sort of slightly an abstract, slightly intangible as a question, but it's the process you go through on the build-up. And it's another one I think people can apply to different life areas, whether someone watching this is a competitive athlete or whether they are pursuing something else as a big goal. Handling these feelings, the pressure and all that sort of thing is very important. So how do you do that? I mean, if this makes sense, because you mentioned about it and it sounded like you were so far out of your comfort zone, obviously, but you still did well. So I'm curious, and I know that you've been obviously involved in sports all of your life, so that's bound to come into it, don't get me wrong, but there's still got to be certain methods that you use to handle these processes. So could you shed a little bit more light on that, if that would be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say it's very much a work in process. By no means am I at the point where I would like to be. I work quite extensively with a sports psychologist because they know that this is one of my weaker points. And if I'm being perfectly honest, my emotional regulation tool in the last little while has been to cry a lot the day before a race. All the emotions hit me like a brick, and then they all just spill out. And it's honestly pretty much a full-on breakdown. but I'm trying to work with my sports psych so that we don't get to that point so that we can regulate my emotions a little bit so that they don't build up to that critical mass. But I think what has been working for me in the last couple of years, I think I'm slowly starting to get better at regulating my emotions, is really just knowing what I'm good at. And for me, when it comes to racing bikes, to be perfectly honest, I'm not the most technically skilled rider out there. I'm probably not the strongest, but my strength is that I am really good at suffering. I can put myself in that pain cave and I can stay there for as long as it's necessary. And we know that. So my coach once told me that the whole reason I was good at riding bikes is because I like to suffer. So as weird as it might sound, my mental talk going into a race is all you need to do is go out there and suffer like nobody else can suffer, because that is my strength. And it's probably due to maybe growing up with two older brothers, maybe the having grown up in a variety of different sports. But I think the other thing that I've been trying to work on is that regardless of whether I have a really good performance or a really bad performance, I give myself 24 hours. 24 hours to revel and kind of have a little pity party for myself, have a really bad performance. And also for most performances, like 24 hours to really feel elated for really good performances. And then it's back to work. Because otherwise especially with those bad performances, you can get into your own head. You can have these little pity parties, and it can be really hard to get out of those pity parties. It can be really hard to find the discipline and the motivation to get back up and get back on that bike and turn it over when you know the last performance, that last training session wasn't as successful as you would have liked. But I also think having school to balance it out is really beneficial. And a lot of people ask me, how do you balance elite sport and PhD studies? But I think that I can succeed in both elite sport and PhD studies because I have the other. My entire identity is not wrapped up in one or the other, which means that I've got something else. I could have the best race of my life and I'm going to go back to campus and half the people there aren't even going to know that I was gone. So I think it's very humbling, but also knowing that I could have the worst race of my life and I could go back to campus and half the people aren't even going to know I was gone. The sun is still going to come up. The sun is still going to set, and everybody who loved me before that race started is still going to love me at the end of it. I've got to kind of give a little bit of a shout out to the entire coaching staff at Cycling Canada, because they've worked so hard at creating a culture where we are people first and athletes second. So it's never been a question about our worth as a person or our membership on the team based on one performance, which I think really allows us to try something that might be a little bit risky and it might end up in failure, but we know it also might end up in success. It allows us that room to grieve if we've had a bad performance. It allows us that room to celebrate if we've had a good performance.
Wonderful. That's a very, very profound answer. Wow. I mean, I knew it would be a good answer, but that's really something, because there's quite a lot of wisdom condensed within that. So thank you again for sharing, and that does touch on your education as well, because well, that's simply put, that's a remarkable achievement, to be quite honest, especially balancing the two. So I'm glad we got to give that a mention, especially because I missed that in the intro. I meant to mention PhD studies, so I'm glad we got to give that a mention. Thank you. I really think that the last thing mainly is obviously your future plans. You touched on this sort of in passing just now, about there being a fire, lit under you for the future. But please do share with us what your plans are, what your dreams are, what's motivating you now to go forward just a little bit more. Like I say, I know we did touch on it, but it'd be good to highlight that a little bit more and talk about the goals that you're aiming for and the process that you're going through working towards them, really.
Yeah, so my kind of long-term overarching goal right now is going to be the Paris 2024 Paralympic Games. I'm really motivated to hopefully upgrade the color of that bronze medal to a silver, maybe a gold. So that's kind of my overarching goal. I would love to also win a medal in the time trial on the road, so double my medal count from Tokyo. But that's a long ways away. That's almost 2 years out at this point. So there's got to be a lot of kind of short-term stepping stones that are going to lead us in the right direction leading up to that. So for me, that's kind of looking like just getting on the bike and doing my job every single day. That's balancing school and training so that I can get on the bike every day and I don't end up burning out. Uh, right now in Canada, because we're training inside, because it's cold in winter, motivation can be it can be really hard to come by because I've got 3 hours to ride on my indoor trainer on the weekend, which isn't all that much fun. But for me, it's not about motivation per se. Motivation is fleeting, it comes and goes. Sure, motivation will take you a really far distance in a really short period of time, but it's not going to take you the distance. So I really don't rely on motivation. For me, it's all about discipline. I know that if I don't plan out my days, I'm not going to get everything done that I need to do. And I know that if I don't plan them accordingly, such that if I've got a really important training session, that's got to be done in the morning. If I've got a really important school thing, that's got to be done in the morning and training later, because I know my morning is my most productive period of time. So right now, we don't have a lot of competitions in the immediate future. So it's just kind of one foot in front of the other, putting in the miles, putting in the hours until we can get to spring, where I'll have my first race with track nationals in, I think, March or April. And then all of a sudden the competition schedule comes around and it's hot and heavy with World Cups in Europe, World Cups in the United States, World Championships in Glasgow. So I know it's going to be hot and heavy, but I'm trying to enjoy the little bit slower pace of off-season training, putting in the miles, putting in the hours so that when we can get outside, I can make the most of it. But also I'm hoping to finish up my PhD in June or July. So also trying to think about what the next step in that capacity might be, and then how whatever that next step might be is going to look like balanced in side by side with cycling.
Absolutely. Well, there's some wonderful plans there. Obviously, you're putting the work in. I'm very sure these will come to fruition. Keely, it's been a wonderful talk today because obviously, even though we've walked through some of the highlights of your career and well, the highs and the lows, really, I think it's safe to say, plenty of both. We've also shared some very, very valuable wisdom that you've gained from your journey, as I know I keep saying this, but people can apply to any area of life, and that's a big reason why I do what I do. So I'm very, very happy with that. Thank you so much for sharing what you've shared, some of the lessons that you have learned. Really, the very last question that I always usually close out with is something you touched on earlier. You mentioned giving a shout out to the entire coaching team. You mentioned giving them a shout out. Now, with elite athletes and people such as yourself, there are a lot of people doing good work behind the scenes. And the reason I say behind the scenes is obviously you know them in your life and they know you and everything. But when people are looking on from the outside, they see the performances, they see they see you on the track, they see how well you're doing, but they don't always see the other people who help to give you that extra push. And throughout this talk today, we've touched on some of those people. Obviously, your family, obviously the coaching team, obviously certain people. So I like to give them a mention at the end, really, because they just don't get it. A lot of the time, they are behind the scenes. Are there any other people that you'd like to give a mention to, a shout out to, who really helped you on your journey, or have we covered them all during the course of this?
It's funny because cycling is, for all intents and purposes, an individual sport. But just because I'm the one on the bike on the start line doesn't mean that I'm the only one who got me there. Again, it's a full team effort. It's the coaches with the technical stuff. It's the dietitians making sure we're fueling appropriately. It's the mechanics making sure we have well-functioning bikes. It's the sports psychs making sure we're in the right frame of mind. But over and above that, there's the other people in our lives that allow us to pursue sport at this level. It's my husband, Andrew, who takes care of the dogs and is taking care of the house and allows me to take off for 20 weeks every year to go race my bike. It's my parents who, they know if I'm really stressed and the house needs clean, they'll just call somebody to come clean my house. It's those people who don't wait for you to ask for help, because I'm sure a lot of people listening to your podcast, a lot of athletes, are not very good at asking for help sometimes. So it's those people who are willing, who offer the help or just do it without having to ask. And even on the academic side, the entire academic team in the College of Kinesiology at the University of Saskatchewan, because they've bent a lot of rules for me for how long I'm allowed to be gone from the general lab space, and zooming in for classes online before that was a thing. So it's really, while I'm the one on the bike, it's definitely a team effort, and more so than just the athletic team. It's the family supporting, it's the friends. And I think more than anything, allowing me to succeed is, like I kind of mentioned earlier, knowing that everybody who loved me before I got on the bike are still going to love me when I get off the bike. And that just allows us to put a few things into perspective, to know that if not winning this race is the worst thing that happens today, I'm doing all right.
Wow, well, that's powerful. That's a very, very powerful way to end this. Keely, thank you so much for your time. It's really has been a pleasure. I knew it would be good talking with you, but this has honestly exceeded my expectations. I really do mean that. It's really, really, really been good. I don't know if you realize it, because we're talking about your own life in a very candid way, but there's so much that you have shared that's of great value. And honestly, I wish you the very best of luck with your future pursuits. I'll be supporting and cheering you on, type of thing, even from thousands of miles away, if that means anything. But it's been a wonderful talk today. So once again, thank you for your time, and I really do appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. It was such a great chat with you today, Liam.
Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe to the Simply Inspired YouTube channel, and there'll be more videos coming soon.